This film series opens up with the main protagonist of the story. His name is Jimmy Keene. He is played by Taron Egerton. Jimmy was a football player back then in high school, but his life takes a 180-degree turn after he starts dealing with narcotics. One day he goes to his supplier, Rog, because the drugs he received aren't in the right amount. Rog is offended that Jimmy accuses him of reducing the number of drugs, let alone a kilo. He won't even steal a gram from his customers because trust is the most important thing to him. Jimmy enters a room with Rog, where he sees his friend Danny being held captive by Rog because he stole Rog's drugs. His childhood friend tells him if he needs money to pay his debt. Rog is furious. He shoots his firearm several times. Even though Danny is a troublemaker, Jimmy still pities him, and in exchange, he gives 3 kilos of his drugs to Rog. Later that night, Jimmy visits an expensive restaurant. He meets a beautiful waiter and introduces himself to her. What happens after, I'll leave it to your imagination. The next morning, Jimmy is having breakfast when suddenly a group of DEA agents storms in. These people are led by a woman from the FBI named Lauren McCauley. Not only the sleeping waiter, but the DEA agents also find various pieces of evidence in Jimmy's house, such as illegal drugs, stacks of cash, and multiple guns loaded with bullets. He also has a shotgun and AK-48 rifle, but he doesn't have permits. The discovery of these weapons would inflict heavy punishment on Jimbo. That's what Lauren calls him. Jimbo is calm because he believes that he has a good lawyer. Jimmy has to stay in a prison. His father comes to visit him. Turns out his father is a former police chief who has served for 23 years. He has talked to the public prosecutor named Beaumont. Previously, Beaumont wants to prove that Jimmy is a part of a syndicate. In reality, Jimmy is not a part of any syndicates, but if he pleads guilty he will be sentenced to 5 years in prison. If it weren't for those firearms, he would only be sentenced to 2 years instead. The lawyer would try to convince the judge that Jimmy was merely a lost boy. His father tells him to behave well. If he's good, they will probably release him in 4 years. At the trial, Jimmy admits all of his involvement in narcotics. He also confesses that he owns illegal firearms. Sitting in the back, Lauren is watching the trial. The judge sentences him to 10 years, 5 years longer than his father's prediction.
Guideline term of 120 months.
Jimmy is pissed, and he vents his anger to Beaumont. 7 months later, Jimmy is visited by the FBI agent and prosecutor Beaumont. According to the prison record, it is known that Jimmy manages to have a good relationship with his fellow inmates, including some of the gangsters who ruled there. Jimmy also has a side hustle there. He rents porn magazines to them. His calm demeanor and charismatic personality make him befriend any criminals, and Lauren wants to give him a special mission because of this. She wants to move him to a maximum security prison. Jimmy needs to get information about where 14 women's bodies were buried. They were killed by a crazy psychopath. So far, the police only found 1 body. It means Jimmy has to get along with the devil to find out where he buried his victims. No matter how much money will be given to him, Jimmy refuses this offer. But instead of money, they offer him his freedom or a full pardon for his sentence if he can retrieve the information. Jimmy still refuses it even though Lauren tries to persuade him. The perpetrator has filed an appeal, and if he's released, a lot of women out there will be his next victims. In the end, Lauren gives up, but she leaves the case files with him, just in case Jimmy has a change of heart one day. Later that night, Jimmy can't sleep, so he decides to take a look at Lawrence Hall's records, the suspected serial killer case. Flashback from 4 years earlier, it was revealed how they found out about this serial killer case. A detective named Brian gets information from the chief detective of Marion County about the discovery of the body of a girl named Jessica Roach. A mechanic informed the police if he saw a suspicious man drive off in a gray Dodge. 11 months later, Brian found a new lead. Turned out a man named Larry owned a car that matched the description of the mechanic. He also had been reported thrice in a harassment case. Back to Jimmy, after much consideration, he decides to accept Agent Lauren's offer. His father disagrees since Springfield is a special prison for crazy and barbaric criminals. Most of those convicted there has been sentenced to life and resigned themselves to their fate. His father is worried Jimmy's plan would fail. What if someone frames him and he will get an additional sentence after that, a longer one maybe? Even though he doesn't know yet, Jimmy's father promises that he will find a way to get him free faster. Continuing his investigation, Brian sought help from a detective named Chris, who happened to have grown up with Larry in his hometown. According to him, Larry liked to participate in the Civil War reenactments. Even though he's having a comfortable life in prison, Jimmy still feels bored with his daily activities. As he sees the files, Jimmy thinks about taking the offer. After checking with the relevant departments, Brian didn't get any information about the permits granted by the Civil War reenactment activists, but there was a permit granted for the reenactment of the Revolutionary War. Brian was surprised after knowing the day of the reenactment was the same day as the day the body was found. Jimmy is visited by his stepmother, who tells him that his father is having a stroke, which makes him very weak. He keeps worrying about Jimmy in the prison. That's the trigger of his stroke. In his current state, his father didn't have much time left. Brian called Chris again. Chris thought Larry was not a dangerous man. He grew up in a graveyard. His parents were gravediggers. His personality was weird because of his intellectual disability. He was bullied a lot back then when he was a child. Brian also learned if Larry was lying. He confessed to other investigators that he had killed a girl in Marion City. The police did not believe him because the real perpetrator had been arrested. Jimmy meets Lauren again to accept his offer, but Jimmy's decision is not immediately accepted because Lauren has other applicants and she offers them the same thing. Lauren will report this to her boss. She orders Jimmy to study the file so he doesn't flunk in the next interview. Arriving at the local police station, Brian met Chris. He found out that Larry was being interrogated by another detective from Marion County in the case of the Trisha Rietler murder. And finally are introduced to Larry, the suspected serial killer. Seeing his appearance, the two detectives didn't think Larry is the culprit. Brian secretly tries to investigate Jessica's murder as well. He asked Larry whether he joined the Revolutionary War reenactment last summer. He showed Larry a map to help him remember, but Larry was acting strange. He didn't want to touch Brian's hand. Brian became more curious after Larry confessed that he had a Dodge van, the type of car the witness had seen at the crime scene. Larry was weird. Brian was able to draw some conclusions from his confession. He told other detectives that he often dreamed of killing women. The film continues to the second episode. A curly-haired girl was walking alone. She walked beside a car, then she disappeared. Was she Trisha Rattler, one of the victims in Marion? Lauren is interviewing Jimmy about the women he likes, including the types of women he doesn't like. Jimmy is so confident that one day he would make Lauren his. Apparently, Lauren had other motives. This thing is important because the person Jimmy would later have to befriend was the murderer of many women. When Lauren asks what Larry doesn't like about women, Jimmy says he doesn't know. Lauren is pissed. Why didn't he study the case files properly? Back to Brian. During interrogation, he confessed that he often killed women in his dreams. At that time it felt like his soul was separated from his body. It was also known that Larry has a non-identical twin brother. His name is Gary. Brian then showed him Jessica's photo. Larry started acting strange. He didn't want to see the picture at all and wanted to go home. Larry's statement about his dreams and his responses after seeing the photo was enough for Brian to see if Larry had anything to do with Jessica's murder. However, the state detectives did not want him to take over the case. Brian asked for help from an FBI agent, Lauren. They also asked Prosecutor Beaumont to help them with this case. Meeting with Lauren again, Jimmy is so confident the FBI will choose him. As a former football athlete, Jimmy is confident that he will succeed in completing his mission. Lauren opens her laptop and shows him a ranger and boxing champion will be his competitors for this mission. Lauren is angry again when Jimmy doesn't give him an honest answer when she asks them about the cause of his parents' divorce. His father was a heavy drinker and often took bribes while serving as a police chief, and his mother changed partners every day. They abandoned Jimmy, causing Jimmy to be involved in narcotics. Since he was a child, Jimmy always felt lonely. Lauren is not asking all of these without reason. Later, when he's around Larry, he'll have to position himself as when he was 8 when Jimmy feels like no one understands his situation. Larry's interrogation continued. This time Brian brings an FBI agent named Mark to accompany him. In another room, agent Lauren is monitoring them. Before answering any questions, Larry had to sign a statement letter first.
What is this?
Talking with me, answering a few questions.
What's interesting was, Larry refused to sign a second letter containing the approval to do a polygraph test or use a lie detector. Larry refused, afraid he would not pass it. When Brian went back inside the room, Larry was uncomfortable and just wanted Mark to be there. Larry admitted that he was lonely because he didn't have a girlfriend, and he also had low self-esteem. He had to suppress his urge. Maybe that was the reason for his nightmares. Mark gave him Jessica's photo, and this time he seemed calm. He said he first met her when she was cycling, and after that, she got into his car. Larry said he didn't have time to bury her. The location in Indiana mentioned by Larry was near the location where the police found her body. Larry admitted to killing several other women, including a woman in Marion named Trisha Rietler. Larry's shocking confession was enough for the police to charge him in court. Mark immediately retyped Larry's confession when she first saw Trisha, then pushed her into his car. After strangling her to death, he also raped her. Before he changed his mind again, they immediately showed the confession letter to Larry so he could sign it. But after reading it, Larry denied doing that. The cops were lucky that Larry agreed to sign it.
No wonder why I can't sleep at night.
The FBI acted quickly, and Larry's house was immediately searched for evidence. They found 2 vans, one van filled with stuff while the other one looked empty and had been cleaned thoroughly. Later it was revealed that Larry was a janitor and his boss told them that he was very good at his job. Jimmy then asked about Larry's twin brother named Gary. Lauren explained about the transfusion syndrome of twins in the womb. One of the babies will absorb more nutrients than the others. As a result, Gary grew up smart with athletic abilities, while Larry had intellectual disabilities. This is Gary, who desperately tries to defend his brother.
Your brother confessed to 2 murders. Okay, we don't kill people. We don't know people who kill people.
In conclusion, Lauren wants Jimmy to act like Gary the next time they meet. Jimmy is surprised when Lauren immediately takes him to take a private jet to carry out the mission because he has been chosen. The agents who take care of him are kind, removing the handcuffs and giving him casual clothes. In his new prison later, only the warden and the chief psychiatrist know about this plan. Jimmy will tell everyone if he's an arms dealer since the prison is famous for being inhabited by first-class criminals. Lauren says that she will come to visit him in prison and she will pretend to be Jimmy's girlfriend. Jimmy boldly flirts with this FBI agent, asking her to practice being his girlfriend right now on the plane. Brian officially moves Larry from the state police to the police station where he served. On their way, Brian tries to investigate this psychopath again. Strangely, Larry behaves like an intelligent person forced to make a confession he simply didn't do. Getting off the plane, Jimmy continues his journey using the prisoner's car. As Jimmy approaches the prison gates, he feels scared and doubtful about this mission. He wants to back off. His bodyguard tells Jimmy if this is an important mission, they have to prevent more victims. Finally, Jimmy decided to continue this mission. During the appeal hearing, the judge outlined several points, especially Larry's mental disorders. Larry also said he confessed because of the pressure from the detectives. The judge grants Larry's appeal.
Described by fellow officers as intimidating. Mr. Hall's appeal is hereby granted.
It means Jimmy only has a month to get information about the places where his victims were buried as evidence, otherwise, Larry will be free again. In this Springfield prison, Larry is working as a janitor. Entering his new prison, Jimmy must undergo a series of examinations first. Then he gets into his cell. The officer told him to try his best for his first week here because it was the toughest thing to do. In addition to being careful with cleanliness, Larry is also good at repairing machines. Jimmy tries his best to fit in a prison inhabited by first-class criminals. On his first day in prison, Jimmy can't sleep at all. He sees Larry enter his cell and they both stare at each other. At the beginning of the episode 3, Jimmy still can't find a way to approach Larry. Jimmy then goes to meet the prison psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Zickerman. He knows about the mission Jimmy is doing. A week in prison is enough to make Jimmy anxious and doubtful. Will he be able to complete his mission? Even though he is in prison, the practice of drug trafficking continues. Not only that, conflicts between prisoners and gangster groups seem to be a common thing. People die because of that, but no one bats an eye. In fact, most of the prisoners have mental disorders, which is why Jimmy found the bloodstains of the previous occupant who had committed suicide in his room. The doctor then gives Jimmy his home phone number. He can call him if he needs help. When Jimmy is getting his medicine, Larry happens to appear behind him. Again, this psychopath is avoiding him. Brian now knows that the person Lauren assigned to approach their suspect is Jimmy Keene, a well-spoken drug dealer. Why can't she just send police intelligence to do it? Larry isn't as stupid as he looks. Lauren is pretty sure the mission will be failed if she sends the police instead of Jimmy. So far, Lauren has investigated various cases in different cities, and many of them have not been solved. But they haven't found the slightest hint of the case related to Larry. Brian himself is pessimistic after Larry changed his attitude when he took Larry to Illinois. His attitude can change 180 degrees from being shy, sad, and feeling guilty, to being cheerful and confident. Even though it was clear that he had previously confessed to being a serial killer. At lunchtime, Jimmy tries to approach Larry at his table. He introduced himself, but again Larry acts cold and indifferent and pretends not to hear him. If he doesn't remember his mission, Jimmy will punch him right at that moment. Escorted by an officer, Jimmy meets his father, who comes to visit, even though today is not a visiting day. Despite being an ex-cop, his father shows them his badge. Jimmy is disappointed because he previously told the officers that he has no family, but now they know his father is a police officer. Because of his weak and senile condition, Big Jim admits his mistake. Not wanting his father to be sad and continue to feel guilty, Jimmy tells him if he's a great father, who was willing to risk his life while he was still active in the police force. Because of his love for Jimmy, his father has rented a motel around the prison. After the visit, Jimmy asks Officer Carter to keep it a secret from other inmates if his father is a police officer. Lauren and Brian are reviewing the cases they suspect are related to Larry. A few years earlier, a woman named Raina was found strangled to death, and her bottle of contraceptive pill was found in Larry's van. They also found a hunting knife, ropes, a mask, and gloves. Surprisingly, a missing persons poster was also found there. The poster said, "Please pray for Trisha Reitler." Due to insufficient evidence, Larry was given a light punishment and was released again. Brian thinks it's so strange that Larry decided to plead guilty to being a serial killer, but after that, he said that he was not a murderer. Their brains and skills as a detective and an FBI agent were really put to the test. Is Larry really a serial killer, or are there other suspects taking advantage of Larry's personality? Back in prison, a senior Italian mafia named Vincent Giganti, who is the most powerful in this prison, meets Jimmy. Both of them are of Italian and Irish descent. This gangster leader has an injury in his shoulder. He invited Jimmy to work with him when many other prisoners would do anything to be able to work with him. He tells Jimmy to keep his shoulder injury a secret from the other prisoners, or Jimmy will lose his tongue. The old man likes Jimmy because he is polite and calm. Jimmy is following Larry to the TV room, and suddenly an arrogant prisoner switches the TV channel. Larry and the other old prisoners are annoyed with his act, but they can't do anything. Then Jimmy stands up and switches back the channel. The prisoner doesn't like it, and this is what Jimmy does to him. Because of his actions, Jimmy is thrown into solitary confinement. After one night in his dark cell, Jimmy is free again. This time Larry wants to talk to him because Jimmy was there to help him yesterday. Jimmy remembers Lauren's words to position himself as Gary, Larry's older brother who is always there for him. Carter comes to meet Jimmy in his cell. Apparently Jimmy's father tells him about Jimmy's mission in this prison. Although he didn't go into details, now Carter knows that Jimmy is an informant. He doesn't care whether Jimmy is a gun dealer from Wisconsin or the son of a drug dealer from Chicago, but it will be a disaster if the other prisoners find out that Jimmy is a son of a cop. Carter knows if Jimmy is rich, he blackmails Jimmy to give him $10,000 to keep his mouth shut. Jimmy is lucky Larry doesn't hear his conversation with Carter. He goes back to his cell, and Larry is sleeping. He is safe now. When Larry wakes up, he sees a photo of Jimmy and his brother wearing old military uniforms for the Civil War reenactment event. The next day Jimmy meets his father to bring him the rest of the money, but it turns out that his father has spent the money on his daily necessities. Not only that, the remaining 2 kilos of his cocaine were taken by Danny, who betrayed him again. Jimmy's last hope is the remaining 1 kilo of cocaine hidden in his speaker. If he failed to get the money, his life would be in danger here. Brian and Lauren pay a visit to the sheriff who handles Raina's murder case. After the previous suspect was released due to lack of evidence, the police arrested Larry since he confessed to murdering Raina with evidence of a bottle of contraceptive medication found in his van. To the policeman's surprise, at the time of the murder, Larry was actually in Ohio for a Civil War reenactment event. These two places are 700 kilometers apart. It needs at least 100 hours for Larry to be there. Also, they have witnesses and photo evidence of Larry being there. How could Larry be in 2 different places at the same time? In conclusion, Larry is a madman who fabricates false evidence of an unsuspected crime to make the police believe that he is the culprit. Jimmy and Larry are getting closer. Jimmy charms Larry with his personality. They told each other about their life stories. But it was still too soon for Jimmy to find information about where his victims were buried. Later, Carter comes to collect his money. Jimmy hopes his father will come tomorrow with 1 kilo of cocaine, and he will sell it to the mafia in this prison. Brian doesn't want to give up on this case. He still believes that Larry is very good at hiding his crimes. But Lauren begins to have doubts that Larry is a serial killer. Maybe he's just a madman who's good at making up lies. Larry takes Jimmy to his office where he is in charge of cleaning and repairing water heaters. Jimmy tries to ask him about what he does besides being busy cleaning stuff. Jimmy almost hears Larry's confession about his relationship with women, but unfortunately, a prison officer enters the room. Jimmy's father is visiting again, but he brings bad news. He couldn't find the drugs in all of Jimmy's speakers. They believe Danny is the thief because he once stayed there without Jimmy's permission. Visiting with full makeup, Lauren disguises herself as Jimmy's girlfriend. So far, Jimmy hasn't heard Larry's confession about the murder he has committed. On the other hand, Lauren began to doubt him. But what is clear is, Jimmy needs $10,000 for Carter, who threatens to reveal his secret. Since Lauren can't give him that, the solution they have is, he has to stay in a protective cell until they transfer him back to his old prison. However, Jimmy can't just let Larry go. He believes him to be the serial killer. He will do anything to complete the mission.
He's not our guy.
He's our fucking guy. He's our guy. Keep your soul on, Lauren.
Then we see Jimmy's childhood. He is playing football with his father after the latter finished his job. Jimmy sneaks into Larry's cell looking for clues to his crime. He is looking through Larry's magazine. There he sees several articles about sexual crimes against women and heinous methods used to kill them. Then Jimmy goes back to his cell. Carter is already waiting for him there. Jimmy thinks it's strange that Carter looks calm even though he hasn't gotten the money he wants. Is he planning something for later? As if he has a seventh sense, Larry thinks something big is going to happen since the prison is eerily silent. He also knows someone has broken into his cell, though he doesn't mind that since none of his belongings is missing. Later in the field, Larry again says something is going to happen. Larry knows that Jimmy is upset, but Jimmy says to Larry that he finds him unpredictable. And later this is what happens. A big riot occurs in this prison. The officers become victims of hundreds of prisoners who go into a rampage. The prison facilities are damaged. Fortunately, Larry and Jimmy are not involved or being victims in this riot. The riot left debris and blood splattered everywhere. As the head of the cleaning team, Larry and his members, including Jimmy, are assigned by the warden to clean up everything.
Well, let's get to it, man.
As they are cleaning the mess, Larry tells Jimmy about his childhood. Growing up near the cemetery, little Larry was forced by his father to dig graves at night, even though his older brother Gary was fast asleep in his room. He had to do it because he was poor, unlike Jimmy who had a happy childhood because his father was a police officer. But surprisingly, Jimmy didn't have any friends when he was a child, and because of that, he spent his days at home, waiting for his father to come home. Then one day his father and mother started arguing every day, ruining the happiness of their little family. His mother was dissatisfied because his father could not satisfy him. Apparently, little Larry was taught by his father to steal the jewelry worn by corpses who had just been buried. As a little boy, Larry was very scared. When the ring on the corpse's finger was difficult to remove, Larry was taught not to hesitate to cut their finger. Jimmy tells Larry that his father was a firefighter and his mother owned a bar, so she had no time for his family. That was when the fight between the two began. His mother was a flirtatious woman who liked to be praised by many men. Like a psychic, Larry could guess that not all of those things are true. Jimmy then tells him about his parents' divorce. 6 months later, his mother took home an abusive man named Glenn with her. The man often beat his mother, Jimmy himself, and his brother. He didn't understand why his mother didn't want to leave Glenn. It turned out that his mother wanted Jimmy to grow up to be a strong man to avenge her, so he took taekwondo, karate, and jiu-jitsu classes. At the age of 14, Jimmy felt he was ready to face Glenn, but later Jimmy was still beaten badly by him. To beat this psychopath, Jimmy confesses to Larry that he wants to kill his mother by pushing her off the stairs. Then Larry tells him if he wants to kill someone he will soak a cloth with starter fluid, and he keeps it in the mason jar in his car. If you use this on someone, it will knock them out in seconds. After Jimmy asks him again, Larry confesses to having done that to the girls, so they stop hitting him. Has Larry put these into practice for the girls? Again, this is not enough evidence. Unlike Larry, as a playboy, Jimmy will seduce every woman he meets, and after that, they will kiss. At the end of the 4th episode, Gary comes to visit Larry. They talk about a woman they picked up in California. In the morning, the woman drove off on a bright green Harley. Was that woman to be Larry's next victim? All of these have not been revealed. Gary informs Larry of the arrival of the police at their home for more evidence. They came because Larry had embarrassed them in the Court of Appeals. Episode 5 start with Jimmy wants to meet the prison psychiatrist, but turns out it's not Dr. the Zickerman who is there waiting for him. Jimmy is disappointed that this psychiatrist has no idea about his mission. As a doctor, this psychiatrist wants to dig deeper into the mental issues he is facing. Jimmy is confused because he thinks his mental state is fine. Apparently, this doctor called Jimmy because Larry mentioned Jimmy as his best friend. The doctor asks Jimmy to sympathize with Larry. She doesn't want Jimmy to be a threat to Larry. Jimmy pretends not to know what she is talking about. It upsets her, then she leaves Jimmy. Brian and Lauren continue their investigation. This time they are investigating the murder of Trisha Reitler. They travel to Marion, hoping to find clues about the location where the victim is buried. In this remote location, you can only see fields and a gas station. Back in prison, Larry tells Jimmy about Gary. He thinks his brother is no longer interested in Civil War reenactments. Gary is now married to a woman who doesn't like the activity because Larry had previously told her about what he did. Jimmy went back to get information from him. When Jimmy asks him how young these girls were he slept with, Larry asks him back in return. Larry looks weird when Jimmy mentions that the girl is 14 years old. Unfortunately, an officer arrives to take Larry to fix the engine leak. After driving around the area, Brian and Lauren finally go to the gas station. The employee tells him if this gas station has been there for several years. Lauren then asks him for the manager's phone number. Brian learns about a mechanic called John Dickey, who owns an auto parts shop nearby. Lauren is informed that this gas station opened in the spring of '94, while excavation started around the middle of the summer of '93. Again, they find nothing since this psychopath is good at covering his tracks. The senior mafia leader hears that Jimmy previously tried to smuggle drugs into the prison. Turns out Carter asks for his help to pay off his debt after he failed to blackmail Jimmy. Jimmy apologizes for bothering him. Larry is having a session with the prison psychiatrist. This psychopath doesn't want to be asked. Instead, he wants to ask the doctor some questions. Larry is confident and proud after his appeal was approved by the judge. One more hearing and he will soon be released. Sometimes people with mental disorders are smarter than their doctors. The doctor says that Jimmy is a charismatic person, but he is arrogant. Larry thinks his friend has suffered a lot, but Jimmy didn't let that stop him. Arriving at an auto parts store, Brian and Lauren meet John Dickey. This man knows Larry. He refers to him as creepy as old fuck. After buying auto parts from him, sometimes Larry would come just to look and watch the girls. In the end, he kicked him out for making the girls uncomfortable with his attitude. His daughter Audrey was one of those girls. Jimmy tries to contact Dr. Zickerman. He tried it several times but failed because his account is unknown. A gangster who is waiting for his turn becomes impatient because he has waited too long. Luckily, they don't fight. In the prison field, Carter begins terrorizing Jimmy by leaking his identity as an informant to other inmates, including the head of the Italian mafia. This, of course, endangered Jimmy's life. Big Jim is anxious because he can't contact Jimmy. He is worried that something has happened to Jimmy. Apart from being in the heating engine room, Larry also likes to spend his time in the workshop. Recently, he has been busy carving crows out of wood. After the carvings are finished, he will send them to his house. When Jimmy asks what they are for, this psychopath changes the subject. He asks Jimmy, why did Jimmy get into trouble in the phone booth? This is where Jimmy tricks Larry. He admits that he has a problem with an officer who has something to do with Larry. The officer says Larry is a predator and a murderer of young girls. Larry laughs at that, admitting he had never raped anyone in his life. He only slept with grown-up girls. Again, the story is cut short. Larry wants to know the number of women Jimmy has slept with. Jimmy confessed that he had slept with about 80 women. Jimmy is good with words. The women were charmed by his charisma. In contrast to Jimmy, Larry always feels insecure. Women won't even look at him twice, let alone talk to him. Larry admitted that one of the women was named Jessica Roach, a woman that Brian found in the field. Her bicycle's tire was flat at the time, so Larry offered her a ride. In the van, Jessica tried to run, then Jimmy asks him why did she do it. Larry gives him a suspicious look. Why do you ask? Jessica asks him about the beard on his face. When Larry tried to kiss her, that's when Jessica reacted badly. She slapped and beat him. He had no choice. He smothered Jessica's face with starter fluid, and after that, he took her to an isolated place. Jessica fought back, scratching his hands until the skin peeled off. Larry is very smart. He is not as stupid as he looks, and he knows how to eliminate the evidence. He cleaned the flesh of his skin that stuck between Jessica's fingernails to prevent the DNA from being discovered. He smothered and beat the girl until Larry felt like he lost consciousness, like he was dreaming. All he remembered was that they were both naked at the end. Hearing this story, Jimmy tries to control his facial expression to look as if he enjoys hearing the story. Deep inside, he is so perturbed by Larry's heinous act. It didn't end there. Larry dragged the girl to the middle of the field. Using 2 leather belts around her neck, a stick was used to spin it like a tourniquet, and he could hear her neck make a crack sound. That was when Jessica Roach breathed her last breath. Brian and Lauren interview Audrey about her encounter with Larry. That creepy man persuaded her several times. He even asked her to get into his van. Also, he gave her 2 earrings, a pendant, and ballet shoes. The items aren't there anymore after being sold at the lost items auction. It turns out that there is one more item stored in the warehouse. Much to Brian and Lauren's surprise, it's the bicycle that belonged to Jessica. And here she is with her bike. Brian shows the evidence to Prosecutor Beaumont, but the evidence is not enough to catch the perpetrator since the serial number of the bicycle has been erased with acid. It is impossible to find the fingerprints of Larry or Jessica on that bike after 4 years. Since this is not enough, Jimmy's the only hope they have. That night, Jimmy's father watches the prison from outside. We can see the sadness in his eyes, thinking about his son. Back in his cell, Jimmy ignores Larry when the latter calls him. It's because he's trying to control himself after hearing Larry's confession. Jimmy has a nightmare later that night. When he wakes up, Larry is in his cell. He is surprised when Larry says what he said yesterday was just not true. Hearing this disappoints Jimmy. He feels being lied to. Jimmy asks, why did he murder Jessica, but he did not bury her, even though he was a gravedigger? Larry explains, it was dark at that time and he saw a man near his van. If you remember, that man was a mechanic and a witness at the crime scene. When Jimmy says that Larry is a liar, he gets angry. He isn't lying and the story is true, but Jimmy doesn't believe it. The look in his eyes doesn't say if he was a murderer. Larry takes Jimmy to the woodshop to show him his true self. That morning, Jimmy's father, who is having breakfast, is rushed to the hospital because of a stroke. Entering Jimmy's woodshop, he sees Larry working on his map with dozens of scattered dots. At that moment, Jimmy tries to remember it in detail because he is sure if the map is related to the location where his victims were buried. There are 21 points there. He also has 21 carved crows, which is a symbol of death. The map and crows will be sent to his home.
Shipping these to Gary?
Home, yeah. Do you know what they're for, James? They watch over the dead.
This time Larry admits that he murdered Trisha Reitler by stabbing her several times because she kept hitting him. Then Larry immediately strangled her. Again, he lost consciousness while raping the lifeless girl. When he woke up, he was naked. Larry confesses to murdering Trisha and burying other women without anyone knowing. Since the time is running out, Jimmy tries to persuade Larry to give peace to the victims and their families by telling them the location of their graves. Larry refuses to do it because he wants to get out of this prison. This man laughs. He thinks Jimmy is joking. Jimmy is running out of patience. He snaps and says that he will make sure Larry loses his appeal court and rots in this prison for the rest of his life. When Jimmy lashes out, Larry realizes that Beaumont has sent him here, and suddenly this happens.
Oh my God.
Give these people some release.
Never. Because, James, right out those doors and keep on living my life.
You'll never get out of here.
Fucking monster! Oh my God! You fucked! That you did fuck your mother! I know you've already...
Back in his cell, Jimmy tries to contact Dr. Zickerman, but the officers refuse to help him. In the morning, the female psychiatrist unexpectedly drags Jimmy to solitary confinement. It looks like Larry has been spreading lies about him. Even the officer refused to give him a pen. Big Jim is in the hospital. He's supported by a ventilator since he's already so weak. There is only one thing on his mind, the map. When the food arrives, Jimmy asks for a pen again, but they ignore him. He doesn't give up and uses his blood to draw the map on the cell wall. Meanwhile, Larry himself casually sends the crows and the map to his house. Although not perfect, Jimmy manages to draw the map. He is very weak after losing too much blood. Back to Brian and Lauren, they travel to Larry's parents' house to continue the investigation. It seems like his father is burning something there. Since they don't have a warrant, Gary only lets them talk outside the house. These two people persuade Gary to tell the truth about his brother's true nature. He agrees that his brother is not normal, but that doesn't mean he's a murderer. When Gary returns inside, Brian and Lauren take their guns, worrying that something bad will happen. But it turns out that Gary brought a few photos with him. Tearfully, Jimin tells the officers about his mission assigned by the FBI, but they don't believe him. 10 years ago, Gary and his sister gave a drunk girl a ride. The girl wanted to take Larry's virginity. When the three were drunk in the tent, Larry raped the girl. Larry's behavior at that time was very scary, like a wild wolf. At that time, Gary could only watch in silence. He was very shocked with what he witnessed. Even though the girl was fine and left the next day, Gary couldn't deny that there was something evil inside his younger brother.
Sometimes a girl says no, but her body's saying yes. When this girl said no, she goddamn meant it. I see him He looks like Wolf.
What were you doing during all this?
In shock. No?
Finally, Jimmy can breathe easily because Dr. Zickerman comes to get him out of solitary confinement. Lauren, who comes to this prison, immediately hands him a pen so Jimmy could redraw the map. At the same time, the map and birds arrive at Larry's parents' house. Still traumatized, Jimmy can't draw it well. Moreover, he knows where the graves are located. Lauren smiles when Jimmy says he has heard the details of Larry's confession about the murder of Jessica and Tricia. She thinks that's enough for his testimony at the appeal court. Either he thinks they are unimportant or deliberately covering up for his son's crimes. Larry's father burns the map and the birds. Considering his success in his mission to uncover Larry's crimes, Attorney Beaumont and his team manage to convince the judge to release Jimmy. Out of the courtroom, Jimmy meets Brian for the first time. Although the graves are nowhere to be found, Jimmy has made sure the serial killer won't bury another woman. In the hearing, the judges decide to deny Larry's appeal.
The petitioner's appeal is hereby denied.
Because of that, Larry has to live in prison for the rest of his life. Since it's based on a true story, it's known that Larry has attempted to commit suicide in prison, but he failed. Big Jim is so happy his son is returning home. Gary goes to visit his brother because he thinks this is the best place for him. He urges Larry to tell the truth, but Larry kept his mouth shut, believing he's been corrupted. On the plane, a beautiful flight attendant caught his attention. While gazing out the window, Jimmy sees a field similar to the map Larry has drawn. After confessing to 15 murders, to this day none of the grave sites were found and Larry spent the rest of his life in prison. And after that, the film ends.